We don't have one. I can quick put it on.
Right.
Oh, we can.
Hi, everyone.
Okay.
I'm glad to present our guest speaker today, Dr. Charles Rice. So he'll be talking about soil health as a driver for change in food production systems. So Dr. Rice is from Illinois, graduated in geography from North Illinois University, and received his master and PhD from the University of Kentucky in agronomy. Currently, a student professor in agronomy department at Kansas State University. And Dr. Rice teaches course and conducts research on soil carbon and nitrogen, soil health, microbial ecology, and climate change. So now, I'd like to pass the word to Dr. Rice.
All right. You got one, so. All right, thanks, everyone. So I'm gonna try to keep this somewhat informal. But as you know, I'm a soil microbiologist, working on soil health. And some things I won't talk about because I know Carlos is giving his seminar tomorrow, so I didn't want to affect his seminar. So anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit about soil health, but and I'm trying to make the argument that soil health is, and some of the practices that promote soil health are the driver for change in food production systems. We have food production systems under threat that we need to increase productivity by, depends on who you talk to, anywhere from 30 to 70%. But we also got a change in climate that's making things a lot more complicated to produce our food. So this is a picture of the Konza Prairie. I work out there. Depends on the funding cycle, but anywhere from 20 to 70% of my research was out at Konza Prairie Biological Station. How many have been out there? If you haven't been out there, you need to get out there. And they're always looking for volunteers to help burn in the fall, in the spring. In that, but the reason when I first got here a long time ago, I did a lot of work out at the Konza Prairie. And the reason I like that is I consider the prairie to be kind of the epitome of being a water efficient, climate resilient, nutrient efficient system. And so when I work on ag systems, I try to think of how can I make those ag food production systems to be more like the prairie. They're not going to be exactly like the prairie because it's a perennial system. And a lot of our crops, we're looking at annual systems, and that the system's different root, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so just introduction, advertise for my lab. Well, you guys are not been here long enough, but we have K-State is ending a 2025 plan they did several years ago. And so we actually had an exercise in our lab, develop a vision and a mission for our lab program to meet up with the K-State 2025. And so our vision for the lab, and we need to update this, the university's doing a new visionary plan, so I guess we'll have to have a new one. But our vision is to have a sustainable food, fiber, and fuel agriculture systems that is productive, they are productive, efficient with water, nutrients, and energy, and resilient to climate change and promote soil health. So things I just mentioned on that. And then our mission is to provide the state and national and international leadership in understanding microbial ecology and grassland and ag systems. And you can read through that. The core focus areas right now depends on funding cycles, but I try to keep anywhere from 2 to 4 themes in our lab. Partly because funding, if one funding cycle goes out, it goes out of popularity. I have others as backup, so we don't crash and burn. But the idea is really the basic. That's always been for the 30 some years I've been here, is understanding the microbial ecology and carbon nitrogen cycling in grassland and ag systems. We're working intensively on identifying soil biological indicators of soil health and those practices that sustain health. And I'll talk more about that. Our new area, I guess, emerging area is understanding the role and opportunities for microbes in the rhizosphere that would enhance plant growth and increase efficiency of water and nutrients. And then again, along with my vision, our mission is really then take that knowledge and then can we redesign ag systems for efficiency and resiliency. So Carlos has done another version of this, but I still like this one. This is my holy trinity. I saw health. If you haven't, it's infamous for this now because I got several podcasts. And so I talk about the holy trinity, these three components. If I had to define soil health, if there was one thing, I would say soil carbon. But if you allow me to have three components, the holy trinity, then it would be these things here. I got a green one here. Soil organic carbon, but then microbial activity and some measure of soil structure because they're interrelated. Carbon is the food for microbes. Also, carbon helps build soil structure. Aggregates is our favorite measurement. But then microbes also, with their with fungal hyphae and bacterial glues, also build soil structure as well. And there's carbon trapped inside aggregates or inside those soil structural units. And so they're interrelated. But if you have those three things, now for the soil fertility people in the world, in the room, you know, you probably want to talk about pH and nitrogen and all that other good stuff too. But this is my three core principles. Because if you have carbon, you're going to have those nutrients tied with the organic matter. Well, I haven't left that out. But if you have those things, then you have improved soil structure. That means water is going to infiltrate when we have, with climate change, more intense rainstorm events. So now I'm going to hold that water or let it to penetrate the soil, infiltrate the soil instead of running off. And then when it's dry, because we're going to have intense rainstorm events, but drier periods in between, now I got that water to support those plants. And if I get better root or soil structure, then I'm going to have better root growth. And of course, the nutrients that go with that. And the microbes are there to recycle and make those nutrients available. So then if you have those three components, then ultimately you're going to have a sustainable, productive system that is providing ecosystem services or resilience and soil health. Okay, so another new term. So things are always evolving, and so now the new hottest term is regenerative ag. How many people have heard of it? A few of you. Maybe. Okay, so I just got done this week putting together internal competition for K-State on themes, initiatives, and we put one on regenerative ag. And so there's climate smart ag, there's other sustainable ag practices. But if you look at the principle, I like these principles here, climate smart ag would work as well. But the 6 principles are minimum tillage, no-till. I'm a big no-till fan. You're going to see that. Keep the residue on the soil surface. Again, that's what no-till does. Maintain a living root system where possible. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Crop diversity, we need to have crop rotations in our system. I do not call a corn soybean rotation being diverse, and it's not really rotation. A lot of our problems for the weed scientists in the room, a lot of our problems is we use the same herbicide on both of those crops, and we just sped up evolution. It's going to happen. We got herbicide resistant weed, but when you use the same herbicide every year, you just have sped up evolution. They don't have those problems, well, they're starting to have them in Brazil, but they rotate their crops and they rotate their herbicides. And so they don't, they're starting to get herbicide resistance, but it's not as fast. So when I drive through Iowa, it's corn and soybeans, it's pretty boring. And that's not really rotation. So you have the need to have crop diversity in that rotation. The last or the fifth principle is integrating livestock into that. There's certain advantages where the livestock could graze the cover crops to help terminate it. So that you're using herbicide, it adds additional income. But a lot of our producers in Kansas and across, at least in the Midwest of the United States, they are crop farmers, and then there's livestock producers, and they don't intermix. And I understand why. Justin Knopf is one of our prominent undergrad graduates from K-State. He doesn't want to deal with the cattle. It's another set of skills, hassle, but what he's done is then partner with his neighbor that has cattle. And allows them, I'm probably blocking the camera here, allows them to integrate cattle into that system. I don't think it's an essential component of regenerative ag, but it does add some flexibility and some opportunities for that. And then the last principle, which there used to be 5, but I really like where they've added the 6th principle, is you got to put these ideas in context. What soil, what climate, even what, from a sociological standpoint, their farmer, producer risk, or their aversion to risk, and their acceptance of technology. And that has to be put in context. Not every farmer or producer will want to do all these things, and it has to incorporate all these things. And so you have to think about the sociological aspect as well. I shouldn't do this, but I will. I like the green. Okay, so I told you that I'm a big fan of no-till. I think it's the starting point for soil health, for regenerative ag, or for cropping systems. You can do minimal disturbance, you can do strip till, some other minimal disturbance, but I think at least our work shows that no-till is the gold standard. You start disturbing the soil, the prairie was never disturbed, right? It's disturbed, but it's through the roots and the microbes and earthworms that are mixing the soil underneath. And obviously you can't do no-till with potatoes or carrots or whatever, but some of the root crops, but it's a starting point. Now I know I will accept the idea that no-till doesn't work everywhere, but a lot of people, farmers, producers, don't give it a try. They try it and then they, after 2 or 3 years, then they quit. It takes a different skill set and a knowledge. And in fact, when I've talked to producers that have been doing no-till for over 30, 40 years, I remember talking to a producer in Brazil. He said it's evolving. Every 3 to 5 years, a new problem comes up, new past soil problem, and so he has to adjust. It's a biological system. Okay, it's easy to run steel through the soil. It takes a lot of energy too, but you can cover up a lot of mistakes with a plow. But you're talking about a living system. So why no-till? Well, we know, and I'll show you, it restores soil carbon. Tillage breaks up those aggregates and you get a pulse of CO2 coming out of the soil. One big thing, particularly for Kansas, is that it conserves soil moisture. That residue on that soil surface slows down evaporation and allows that water to go through transpiration. That's what we want. Plus, it builds that infiltration capacity of that soil. It saves fuel. It takes a lot of energy to run that steel through the soil. And so you can get by with less fuel and also less wear and tear on the equipment. So you get by with smaller tractors, and that lowers the cost. It also saves labor, particularly in some parts of the world where labor is, going Kansas. The amount of labor available is decreasing, particularly in the rural sector. And so that you only have to make, ideally, if you did it right, you could probably get by with 2 passes. You could plant, spray, and fertilize in 1 pass and harvest. But that's not necessarily practical, but you cut down on your number of passes through the field, and that's labor. And then there's all these other benefits up there. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, I guess it's almost historic plots right now. This is an experiment out of the North Farm. You can see the satellite. I'm impressed that the satellites, well, I guess I shouldn't be impressed, but these set of plots were started in 1990. So this is the 34th or 35th year that we planted the other day on these plots. This was an idea. It was a start when I first got here. That I got a USDA grant. It was supposed to look at comparing tillage and nitrogen source on leaching. It was a 3-year grant. So we had no-till and tilled, which was a chisel disc system. And then we're comparing synthetic fertilizer and organic nitrogen, which was manure initially, but now it's composted material. And so it sits out there. I was foolish enough to not stop the project. I didn't have any funding, but I did my PhD at Kentucky. That was one of the sites at no-till started, and they have plots in '69. They're still going. And so I wanted to look at the long-term effects of these treatments. And now 34 years later, I probably can't stop them. And somebody will probably have to pick them up after I retire or till I'm under. But there's some, because it's been going over 30 years, we've seen some interesting things and still are in that over that process. So this is carbon in the surface 3 layers, over 5 to 15, and 15 to 30 centimeters. I keep camera. And this is why having these long-term plots are really valuable. So in the top 5 centimeters, you can see here we were adding at this time fresh manure, cattle manure. We lost our source from the animal science unit, and they started composting their material. So then we've been adding compost. But when you add compost, we were adding the equivalent amount of 168 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And compost has less nitrogen available in it. So we have to add more material, okay, more carbon. And so what you see here is a big jump when we start going from fresh manure to composted. And here's the tilled or compost. It goes up, but then it flattens off. It's mixed in, so it increases, but it's pretty much stayed flat for that time period. So basically, if you compare the no-till and the till, you lose 30 to 40% of your carbon by tillage. You just put it back into the atmosphere. But what was interesting is, again, the value is that we increased carbon in the surface, and then it's been pretty much flat. And actually, we took samples last year, 21, 22. I need to get that posted on here, but 21. And that's continues to stay flat. What's interesting here is the 5 to 15 centimeters, it jumped up. We're not tilling it in, but it increased and it continued to increase. And maybe, and it does, if you look at the last plot data, last data point, is that it's leveled off. Okay, the conventional wisdom would be that this soil is done sequestering carbon, storing carbon. Is it? You said yes?
Which type of carbon?
I don't think so. Because this comes saturated or equilibrium, whatever term you like or don't like. This started to increase and then it looks like it's flattening off. And now at 15 to 30, the last data point is starting to accumulate. We've done that. If we stopped this experiment after 5 years, we wouldn't see this. It's fairly unique. There's, in particular with the addition of organic material to that, nobody else has had that kind of system where you push the system in that. I don't know, what's the capacity of soil to store carbon? I don't know. If this reaches an equilibrium, does it move down to 30, 60? 30 to 45, I don't know. Okay, so anyway, and then you can see with no-till, where is it at? The blue line, no-till with synthetic fertilizer, it's increased some. We got a drop off, not sure why, but there's very little change below that. So there's a little bit of increase, but you got to push the system. And then, so what Rodrigo Nicolosa, grad student / postdoc, he did a meta-analysis. And what you see here is around the world, it's looked at no-till change in carbon stocks. This is comparing no-till versus tilled. No-till accumulated, and this was down to, he looked at 2 data sets, 60 centimeters and 1 meter. And I can't remember which one this is from. This is nitrogen as well, but no-till down to 60 centimeters or meter was higher in the no-till system. When you looked at different tillage systems, the no-till was always better by the same amount. I think I put the wrong graph in here. No-till with a single crop or a double crop, and this is with no legume and added legume in the system. I think I did left out a slide. Oh, okay, well, it's in here. So this is showing the whole profile where that carbon is. And so the black line is no-till, the white line is tilled, and this is looking at from baseline, wherever these experiments were, the starting point or some point in time, and then so many years later. And you can see for the most part, no-till is significantly higher in the surface, but also at depth. And this is kind of the baseline line here. If you start adding intensity, double cropping, No-till is even much higher than the tilled system, and that's here. No-till, if you aren't intensifying the system in a no-till system, it's a missed opportunity. Because of the water savings, now I have the potential opportunity to double crop or cover crops and put carbon back into that system and push it. And if I can do double crop, then I get 2 crops in 1 year. So I increase my profitability as well. And then adding legumes into the system, you can also see that we're benefiting. The no-till provides that opportunity. Question on that?
What was going on with the nitrogen?
So the nitrogen, yeah, good question. So this is, and we're seeing this on these long-term plots as well, is that we improve nitrogen in the surface. And that's where your fertilizer or compost is. Well, this is a global study, so most time it was fertilizer. So the no-till conserves that nitrogen. It's in that plant material that gets returned, and slower decomposition is conserved in that system. But what's happening is that we're mining the subsurface. We've seen this in our plots out here, that we're getting deeper roots with the no-till, because we got pore structure, the roots are growing deeper. And now we're mining some of that nitrogen that was there that was in perennials, X number of years ago. And so we're actually losing nitrogen. You double crop, same thing, you're pushing the system. So now you got to think about your nitrogen levels. And so you're actually taking advantage on a carbon side and productivity side, but you're losing nitrogen. So you got to think about then what's your double crop soybeans. Double crop soybeans, they don't fix a lot of nitrogen. They fix a lot of nitrogen, but it's all exporting grain. You got to think about other, cover crops or other species in there if you want to solve your nitrogen problem as well. And that's, you can see here with legumes, you recover some of that pushing back, but you still get some mining. Again, depends on, at least my thinking is, what kind of crops and getting that root material down there. Good question. I mentioned the Holy Trinity, aggregates are one of the key measures. And Carlos will talk about that tomorrow. But what's important in here is that you see the hyphae that are helping to form those aggregates. That green fluffy stuff is organic matter. And that's carbon that's trapped inside those aggregates and at least it helps retain that carbon and has slower decomposition than it's outside those aggregates. And so aggregates not only perform better, help store carbon, but then it provides better soil structure as well. And and what you don't see here, maybe as much, is that this is the amount of aggregates and amount of hyphae. These actually axes should be reversed because we're measuring your independent and dependent variable. But basically, we're seeing a strong correlation between the amount of hyphae in the soil. And what happens with tillage, we destroy that hyphal network. And so having that consistent hyphal network in there helps build aggregates in there. And we get, so more hyphae means more aggregation. What was shocking to me was this relationship between hyphae and organic carbon. And this was all actually done on the native prairie. We suppressed the hyphae, the mycorrhizal hyphae. And what happened over a few years without any tillage, we lost aggregate structure and we lost carbon. That carbon that was trapped in those aggregates, they dissolved, but the aggregates dissolved and we lost carbon. I didn't expect that. That was an aha moment. And a great K through 12 demonstration or teachers, whatever, is you could take aggregates from no-till or the prairie, put them in water, and the tilled ones. What happens? They dissolve. If it's out in the field, where do they go? Down to Lawrence. Okay. Where the no-till and the prairie aggregates are a lot more water stable and they maintain their integrity. And that's really, really key. And so we have we are ongoing, is Tiffany in here? But we have an experiment that we're finishing up, a project where we're looking at the effect of land use across the state of Kansas. Kansas is a wonderful living laboratory for understanding climate change. We go from 450 millimeters of precipitation in southwest Kansas to over 1,100 in southeast Kansas. We have more variation across the state of Kansas than from Kansas to the Atlantic Ocean. So if you want to study climate effects, come to Kansas. So we're comparing native prairie. The other thing about Kansas, because we have native prairie across and still intact prairie across the whole state. So we can compare native ecosystem, what it looked like 150 years ago, and ag systems across the state. So James Lynn, one of my master's students, finished up a couple years ago. This is just showing Tribune, Hayes, and Kanza, and looking at ag and the native prairie. But then he found some farmer sites that what we called enhanced ag, and where it was all no-till, in some cases with no-till plus cover crops. And what you see here is that aggregation is destroyed with ag, or pretty much so. And then in some cases, these are different size aggregate structures, but no-till or no-till plus cover crops is starting to rebuild those aggregates. Not up to the prairie standards, but getting there. Again, that disturbance tillage is really key. And then that translates into infiltration. You can see that we're starting to improve the infiltration on some of these sites. This is Tiffany's work. Tiffany Foydras, master's student that's finishing up this year. But she took that gradient and looked at carbon content in the native prairie in the top 30 centimeters, 0 to 5, 5 to 15, and 15 to 30. And then in the ag sites across that precipitation gradient. I guess she gave a seminar the other last month or so. And what you could see here is that we've lost carbon, okay? If we look at microbial biomass, there should be a relationship between how much carbon there is and how much microbial biomass, when it follows the same trend in the native prairie. What's interesting is that we decouple that. Actually, in the surface, we have a negative trend, slightly negative trend. It's flat or negative. And so we don't have that relationship in the ag system. So ag has decoupled that connection to some extent between the prairie or in the carbon and microbial biomass. So the microbes need that carbon, but maybe it's a different type of carbon. And if this is the one that scared the heck out of me. This is aggregate or mean weight diameter. James' work where he looked at the aggregation in these 3 sites and practices. So the purple line, I guess, is native prairie. And then the red and the yellow are the 2 ag. Red is the conventional till ag, and the yellow is enhanced ag. And what you see here is there's less aggregation in both the ag sites, all the way down to a meter. We're starting to rebuild the aggregates with it no-till, but just in the surface, 15 centimeters or so. This one scared me because I started these plots when I first got here as well in tribute. So this was an embedded experiment. It was native prairie, and there's native prairie in the replication, the treatment design, and then we had no-till wheat and sorghum and tilled wheat and sorghum. In 30 years, we lost aggregates all the way down to the meter. I did not expect that. So we're changing that perennial root system to an annual cropping system, and we're affecting things in a relatively short period of time, 30 years. I thought aggregation would be somewhat more resistant. I didn't think we'd see a change, at least at a meter. I expected the surface, but I didn't expect that. That still shocks me. Okay, and then you can take that gradient and look at the relationship with fungi or mycorrhizae and aggregation. This is the native prairie, and here's all your ag sites. We've destroyed it. Well, yeah, we don't have any aggregates, and we've lost that hyphal network and that connection. Okay, this is my poster child for an ideal system. This is actually originally from Brazil, but I incorporated to North America, to Kansas. Okay, this is a diverse, intense cropping system. It's taking advantage of the water. It's taking advantage of the nutrients. And so, I mean, you could pick your rotation, but basically it's wheat. In this case, in Brazil, it's double crop soybeans, but we could double crop sorghum here. We could put a forage in there during that summer. And then you could come back to wheat as this example, but you could put a cover crop or a forage in there. And then a full season soybean or grain or forage crop sorghum. And then another cover crop, but in this case, it goes, well, corn or sorghum. You would want to put in a legume in that cover crop mix for nitrogen, ideally. And so it's continuously covered. If you think about the regenerative ag principles, it's no-till, you're taking advantage of water, it's continuously covered, and I get 4 crops out of 3 years. And maybe if I graze the livestock or graze the cover crops, I can put cattle as an additional income in that. What's interesting to me when I talk to the farmers I interact with in Brazil is that, and I'm probably in dangerous territory since there's so many Brazilians, but I've done a fair amount of work down there, and the mentality is different. When they think of for the soil fertility people, where did I put my nutrients? What do we do in the US? We think, okay, I got corn, I got to fertilize my nitrogen there, right? Or phosphorus. They think about, okay, maybe it's better to fertilize the cover crop phosphorus and let that recycle through because of the soil chemistry and make it more available for that corn crop. They don't think about that crop that year. They think about it as a system. So it's much more complicated. That's why conventional tillage and monoculture is very simplified. But now we're talking about adding complexity back into this. The other thing that's astounded me, and I know some of you have seen this is a canned photograph, but what are they harvesting? Wheat maybe, or soybeans, I'm not sure. Soybeans, is it? Okay. But the thing is, what do you see behind this? Planter. are planting right behind that. And I thought, oh, this is a canned photograph. But then I talked to a couple big farmers in Rio Grande do Sul and Paraná in Brazil. And they told me they will shut down the harvesters here, combines, if the planters can't keep up. Why? They wanted something green growing in that field year round. What do we do here? We got to get the crops harvested, and then we figure out what we might want to do afterwards. It's part of this system thinking is that I got to plant and harvest and plant right away. And I just, it amazed me that it really is a system way of thinking and think about the whole flow instead of working with a single crop in 3 months out of the year or 4 months. Okay, so anyway, so how can we tweak this system? How can we make it better? Well, we think about with climate change and climate smart ag or regenerative ag, whatever you want to talk about, we need to think about breeding for the crops, varieties that are more drought tolerant, with higher nitrogen efficiency. We need to think about, again, are there crops or design those systems for more intensification and diversification? So everybody in this room should be thinking about that. I want designer cover crops. Instead of, in addition to spending X billion dollars on soybean breeding and corn breeding, if I had 1% of that money to design cover crops for specific purposes, these are orphan crops. If I want a cover crop that have certain root characteristics, whether it's a tuberous root to serve as create biopores, or I want a nitrogen fixer or some other properties, I'd like to have those designed and bred. And think about, again, that whole sequence of events that I showed earlier in that diagram. Maybe we need to have crops, cover crops or cash grain crops for breeding for deeper and denser root systems. I know some of the companies, Bayer and Corteva, looked at short stature corn. It might have a more fibrous root system. Can we have deeper root systems in annual crops? There's a trade-off there, right? If I put more carbon into the roots down deep, then that means carbon might be sacrificed in the grain. Land Institute is working with perennial wheat and perennial sorghum, but they're sacrificing, their yields are not as good because it's got to support that root system. If you look at the prairie in the fall, there's not much seed out there. It's all vegetative. They reproduce by rhizomes and roots, and not so much by seed. So there's a trade-off there. Can we put perennials back into the rotation? Justin Knopf and Doug Palin that we're working with, they're doing 4 or 5 years alfalfa. Doug has put in a perennial mix, or a native prairie mix, warm season mix. He's grazing that for 4 or 5 years, and then he plans to come out of that. Now he's got carbon down deep. I showed you that soil structure and the carbon that we lost. Well, maybe those perennials in that rotation system that can now rebuild that deep soil material and make it more healthier. And then one thing that we've been working on is we need to have, I don't know if you've heard of weather nowcasting and forecasting. Our RAIN project that many are you're part of, Ashland Baum's idea is to look at the probability of certain weather patterns. Can we make decisions, not quite on the go, but if it looks like we're in a dry cycle, maybe instead of planting soybeans after wheat, maybe we plant a summer forage like that's more drought tolerant, and we make decisions on the go. Can we make nitrogen recommendations on the go? do that time. And then perennial crops, yeah, so these are biofuel crops, but think of, could this be hay or it could be biofuel? Or there's some other, it could be graves. And if you look at carbon accrual down deep, this is 2009 and 17, so about 8 years later, we're starting to rebuild some carbon down at depth with some of these rotation systems. I'm not sure why I put that in there. Oh, okay. So yeah, the regenerative ag. So some people think, well, it's going back to the 1950s, 60s, but there's huge opportunities now to look at what I call instead of field management, landscape management. What Bruno Basso is and others have done is started looking at yield mapping, but then looking at adaptive zones. It seems to be relatively common or consistent that we're losing, that about 15%, 20% of a field shouldn't be farmed. They're wasting their money just by planting the seed. It's not productive. Then, of course, all the herbicide and the other inputs, the fertilizer, they're wasting their money. You're not getting your good return on investment. And so what he's making the argument, we should have precision conservation and take those fields, put it in a perennial potentially. And you could then hay it, graze it, be a biofuel crop or a pollinator. And so we should think of the farmscape as a management system to have multiple benefits, whether it's pollinators, whether it has other uses. And we shouldn't be farming, and that would save nitrogen, it would save greenhouse gases, it would save nitrogen leaching and hypoxia. And so we need to think more holistically across that landscape. But you know what? That's hard to do. And you're not going to be able to do that. Not a single person in this room is going to be able to do that. You're going to have to work as a grad student, you're going to have to learn to work in teams. Because it's going to take a computer scientist, a data manager, it's going to have to take a microbiologist, a crops person, weeds person, entomologist. And we need the sociologists, the economists. So you have to think about working in teams, transdisciplinary teams on these wicked problems. And then you go one step further. This is Bruno Basso's. I've modified it for this grant proposal in a regenerative ag. Then the farmscape. Then we got to think about water, carbon, energy, nutrient flows. Where in the field is best for intensifying, diversifying. One thing I haven't mentioned is there's air right now looks like there's an interest in biologicals. And so can we look at that microbe root interaction and enhance that interaction instead of using synthetics? The breeders, no offense to the breeders, but all they've done is look above ground. They've never looked at roots or very little. Root work is hard and destructive. But the opportunities now is, can we breed that symbiotic association, not just legumes, but other microbial traits, and whether it's mycorrhizae or a nitrogen fixer or a phosphorus enhancer, we need to think about those opportunities. But then with precision ag and data management, we can manage those nutrients. We can decide where they should be applied, whether we can maybe with robotics or drones apply nutrients or herbicide on the go and spot. I think I saw somewhere that you could reduce your herbicide by 70–80% or something like that with spot spraying through robotics or drones. Now I can come in with a robot underneath that corn or sorghum and start interseeding in August my cover crop instead of waiting until September, October when it's drier and you lost 6 weeks of growing season. I think I'm just about there. So, okay, so coming back, I think if you look at all those principles, it really does start with the soil. And if you think, of soil as ground truthing, and rooted in the soil, right? Then how can you work the plant system to work with that soil system? So anyway, I think I've touched on a few of these points. But it really does take, and I usually have a slide that talks about, it really takes a transdisciplinary team to attack some of these problems. And this is definitely one. So I'd encourage in training, are there opportunities to work across multiple disciplines in that, working with a computer scientist. I work with a sociologist. We have to have sociologists on our big projects now. And I kiddingly say I'm not a very social person, but it's difficult to work with a sociologist. Why? They have different terminology, different thinking, but it actually has made me think differently and a little more holistically and that. So get outside of your comfort zone and work across those disciplines. All right, questions I guess thank all the funders. This is our lab group and their significant others. And questions. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Of course, there are really the advantages of the no-till systems are very clear, but now I want to know on the other way from the farmer's perspective. What has been the historical limitation of the adoption of no-till systems in the US?
Knowledge and experience and skills. Way back, so there was a big push in the US, a big jump in adoption in the 70s during a fuel crisis. There was cars lined up for hours to get at the gas pump here in the US, and farm was in the same shape. So that, because of the fuel savings, that's where no-till got adopted. People say, well, it's equipment, but most equipment now is all set up for no-till. You don't have to buy a special no-till planter. I mean, they're pretty much available, right? And the equipment was pretty crude I can tell you stories. But the equipment is there. I think it's more, it's still social. You talk to some of the undergraduate students here. It's less so, but their father or grandfather said, okay, you can do no-till on your back 40 here. And so it's the comfort of doing the same thing. The tillage is easy and they're used to it. No-till is hard because it does. You have to think more systematically, systems thinking, because he or she's got to work with, your fertility. Just planting no-till is not no-till, right? You got to think about your fertility, your herbicide, insect program, all that stuff, all integrated in the same thing. And the other thing is transitioning. We didn't see it when we switched, but some producers, a lot of producers, going from a tilled system to no-till, it takes 3 or 5, it seems to take about 3 or 5 years to reset the system, to change the biology. And so there's a little bit of yield drag, depression. And so it seems, I don't know why, but it seems like at 3 years, the system is in the middle of transition and there's problems show up. And the farmers that aren't willing to stick it out for another 2 years give up. But the ones that have gone through that 4 year period, it's like at year 3 or 4, things fall apart. But now you get to 7 years, most farmers won't they've sold their equipment. I was just talking to a farmer last week, and he said they've gotten rid of all their tillage, but it's that window there that, the first year or two no-till is okay, and then they have problems. And, it's a myriad of problems and they give up. So part of it's social, I think some of it's discipline but it is different knowledge. It's a knowledge-based system instead of using steel, right?
I always thought it was maybe also because of the cooler temperatures in the soil when you want to plant in the spring.
That's not so in Kansas.
No, yeah, but I mean.
Right, in Iowa and Minnesota, it's the cool and wet conditions. It is cooler. But, maybe they should be planting a week later. Okay. Actually, with climate change, Iowa, they're forcing, they're getting wetter springs and they are actually planting 2 weeks later in Iowa than they did 30 years ago. Because of climate change. So yeah, in cool, wet soils, no-till is harder. Ontario says they can't do no-till corn. Well, maybe they shouldn't even be planting corn in Ontario, Canada. Too, the sixth principle of regenerative ag is at the right context, right? We can't grow bananas in Kansas, so should they be growing corn in Canada? I don't know. Everybody likes to grow corn.
Because corn is good for soil health, right?
Oh, no, I think it's
Overcrop, organic.
yeah.
Roots and no.
Well, and this one farmer in Brazil, because of soybean market, he was putting more soybeans in his system. And he realized he was having more problems. He said, I got to get corn back into the system. Corn is not a cash crop.
I'm talking about the acronym corn. It's.
Oh, well, yeah, right.
Organic matter, roots and no-till.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Soybeans are the worst culprit for soil.
Question, which are the biggest intention including perennial crops like alfalfa, phase two in the rotation is mostly economic or social?
Yes.
I mean, for example,
Yes.
labor.
Yes, yeah, a little bit of both. If you put a perennial in, besides alfalfa, you're putting a native warm season mix or a cool season mix. It takes a year to really establish. And so you've got a year of minimal, no income, right? So, but you gotta think long-term, and that's what Justin and Doug are doing. And you gotta have a market for that hay or have the livestock to graze it. So, and it's a given, you gotta manage that a perennial. It's a different crop now. You gotta manage it differently. So it takes knowledge.
So in the history, it always switched from, for example, natural grassland into annual crops, the whole rotation.
Yeah, there are some places where they've abandoned the crop land and put it back into grass or let it go back to grass. But in some cases, Doug Palin, for example, planted perennials in his rotation for a purpose. And he plans to take it out after. I need to talk to him when
4 or 5 years.
Yeah, 4 or 5 years. So he's about ready to take it out and put it in annual. But now he's built his soil health to make it more resilient. And so, but he's been able to graze it. But yes, it takes more skills, more time. Corn and soybeans is easy.
That's a little bit of precision conservation. So he identifies an area, marginal area, which is theoretically being degraded, and then he goes back to perennials to recover that area, and then that go back to crop production.
That's great. I mean, that's a question I have because since I arrived, I was kind of shocked when I saw that the entire rotation are with annual crops. I am from Uruguay, and by law, we cannot grow a continuous crop. We have to farm perennial.
Yeah, well, I mean, here in the Midwest, I grew up in Illinois, and there was always pastures, cool season pastures, and they would graze that, and then that was the rotation in the 60s, 70s. But now we've simplified the system. Now we got to go back, but it's not just going back to the 50s or 60s. It's now we got more tools, and can we enhance that and understand it better?
You mentioned that we have more tools, but we are being limited by resources. I'm talking specifically about water. So
Yes.
how cover crops or these more
Yeah.
sustainable
Yeah,
water?
that's a good question, and I, um. I can see where some people say, and I understand, I agree, somewhat agree with it, although my tune's changing a little bit. That you can't do cover crops out western Kansas. But I know there are farmers that are doing it. They're doing it in eastern Colorado, where they're only getting 10, 12 inches rain. Or the other millimeters, whatever. So what I need to do is figure out, I need to go out there and talk to them and learn what they're doing, and then figure out how can we make it
Extend.
extended beyond. That's what we're not going to be. Here in the university, we're not going to be up with the top farmers. For the most part, but what we can do is learn from those top farmers and then figure out what are the principles behind it. So what are the principles behind that? So I know people can do cover crops out in West, and I gotta get on the stick. We got to find 2 farmers out in western Kansas for our network. But the other thing I do know, well, so Justin, I made comment in an extension meeting, and Justin Knopf was there. And I said, well, maybe in a dry year, you don't want to plant a cover crop, just don't waste your seed. He jumped up and chastised me. And I work with him, we're good friends, so I took my class. But he said, I want that seed there, because if there's a 1/4 inch of rainfall, then that seed will germinate and I can get some benefit. He just said, even if I get that much growth, that's worth it to him. And so I've changed my tune a little bit. So maybe, and I know, again, it's taking time, but once you rebuild that organic matter, build that soil structure, you start conserving water. And then I can maybe start to intensify that system. So again, we've degraded these soils, and now we gotta get from here to here. And you can't just say, okay, flip it. It takes time to rebuild it. And so we got to figure out how, that's where the science comes in. How can we get to those steps to get back to, because there was raised grass out there. Well, there still is, and they've talked about the Ogallala aquifer drying up. One solution might be put it back in the grass and graze it. That might be the most productive use of that land.
So can't we grow certain trees to improve the soil health in our fields?
Can what?
Incorporate some trees?
Oh, agroforestry, yeah, that's possible, although we don't like trees in Kansas, we tend to burn them, right? Yeah, and trees are, and in Kansas, trees don't grow, it's harder too. And that's another option. A lot of farmers don't, because their equipment don't want trees in the way. So that's another barrier, but yeah. Trees could be part of that. At least, it used to be windbreaks. But we don't often do that. I know I've worked in parts of Brazil where they have agroforest or integrated crop livestock forestry systems. I think I forgot all the words in there. But trees is another social barrier. I mean, having crops and cattle or livestock, but now you got to integrate trees in that, and that's another skill set. And I don't, it's probably has to be in the right context. But trees have a lot of trees are dying off with the climate change and heat and that. So, yeah.
And when I gonna grow cover crops, and for any reason, I need to choose between the diversity of the biomass and the amount of biomass. Which one you?
No, well, yeah, that's a great question. What do you want out of that cover crop? People just go, well, people do single species, and then some people do a 15 species mix. why do you want that species mix? They just throw it out there and it's more expensive. Think of what you want for that cover crop system. Do I want nitrogen? Do I want biopores? Do I want biomass? I don't know. There's a reason more diversity means that it's going to be, if the weather is wrong, that some of those will die out. You always have some of those species that are more resistant or it's too wet, right? But it's it comes at a cost, high cost. I'm happy with. Well, I guess I would think about, okay, what do I want in that cover crop mix? And I could see maybe three species. And not do this 15 cover crop mix. Because of cost. And to say, okay, I want tillage radish for biopores, I want a legume there for nitrogen, and then do I want biomass, and then triticale or rye. I mean, there's other things you could do. And I'm thinking winter, summer, then you got to think something else. But, Carlos may agree or disagree, but when farmers ask me, start with something simple. If they're going into that, what's easy to do? Triticale and rye. And then figure out system and then start incorporating other things. But those are the two. Actually, wheat is a great cover crop and it's widely available. And it's a flex crop too, because then you can say, boy, it's a great year for wheat, not this year. But then I can harvest it for grain and I still got the residue. Or, you make a decision now and it's dry and just kill it off and plant and have that residue there for corn, soybean, or sorghum, right? So it's a flex crop. Yeah, so I guess I would, wheat, triticale or right. Would be to start simple and then think about adding purposely, what do you want that cover crop to do? Just don't go willy-nilly and say, oh, gee, 15 sounds good, I'm going to do 15. If you want to waste your money, yeah. But I think, what do you want out of that cover?
And thinking about making a mix of 15 cover crops, each one has a different effect, a different benefit.
Right.
At some point, you have a suppression, from one benefit over another.
Right. Yeah, there's the interaction.
Any other question? No. Okay, so then get ready.
Hopefully I made you think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. We know that this is not the first time that you have the AGSA, so we really appreciate it. We hope this is not the last time.
Okay.
We'll be in touch with you, but again, thank you so much for always being willing to help and share your inspiration with us.